Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Journey into Mystery 92, cover dated May of 1963. The issue was written by Stan Lee and Robert Bernstein, drawn by Joe Sinnott, and lettered by Martin Epp. Our issue opens up with a striking splash panel, teasing Thor's coming battle with a group of evil trees, conjured by the wicked Loki. But before we can witness such an epic showdown, we must first travel to Asgard, home of the Norse gods. Existing beyond space and time, Asgard can only be reached by crossing the Rainbow Bridge, known as Bifrost. Its guardian is a mighty immortal named Heimdall, whose sworn duty is to prevent evildoers from entering the land of the gods. One such evildoer may be approaching, as a woman walks up to Heimdall and introduces herself as Neri, handmaiden to the Queen of Asgard, Fricka. While she certainly looks the part, Heimdall does not immediately let her pass, as he knows that she could be the trickster god Loki in disguise. So to prove that she's telling the truth, Neri leads Heimdall to a high hill, from which they can see Loki chained securely to a boulder. As Heimdall lets Neri pass, Loki, having heard their conversation, bursts into a fit of rage, and swears revenge against them, and especially his half-brother Thor. But speaking of the Thunder God, the issue then shifts focus to the medical office of Dr. Don Blake, the mortal identity which Thor assumes when he's not out adventuring. Now that office hours are over, Dr. Blake's nurse, Jane, is leaving to drop off blood samples at a lab. So that leaves Blake alone in his office, although he's done meeting patients for the day. Or so he thought, as suddenly, 3 criminals burst into his office. They're jewel thieves, and one's just been shot by the police. Since they obviously can't just go to a hospital, they've come to force Dr. Blake to extract the bullets, at which point they'll kill him to keep him quiet. Upholding his doctor's oath, Blake agrees to perform on the thief. Skipping forward to once he's finished, Blake mentions to the thieves that apparently Thor's helping the police track them down. Instead of being frightened by such a notion, they scoff at it, as surely Thor won't know to look for them in some random doctor's office. Yet it seems they're wrong, as Blake tells them that Thor is entering their very room. Of course that's not true, but as the thieves turn to face the door, Dr. Blake stamps his walking stick once on the ground, and transforms into Thor. From there he disarms the thieves, and straps them all onto an operating table. After attaching his hammer to the table, he heads outside, and hurls it towards the police station. Soon enough, it lands within the station, and drops off the 3 thieves before returning back to Thor. So with them out of the way, Thor transforms back into Dr. Blake, and returns to his office, where he greets Jane and tells her what's happened. A week later, Dr. Blake, or should I say Thor, travels to a Norwegian film set. He's agreed to appear as himself in a Viking action film, since the proceeds of his contribution will go to charity. His first scene involves him flying into the open mouth of a massive mechanical serpent, and then drowning it in the ocean. Pulling off the stunt with ease, Thor then moves on to a scene where he summons a thunderstorm, flies into its center, and then personally films its core, since no human cameraman could survive such a dangerous feat. Once again, he perfectly executes the stunt, much to the delight of the film's director and crew. But they're not the only ones watching Thor from afar, as so is Loki. With the magical ability to watch events on Earth, even while in Asgard, Loki watches as the director tells Thor about his next stunt. He's going to be hurling his hammer at a mountain, causing an avalanche that will destroy a mock village of evil Vikings. This pops an idea into Loki's head, as he realizes that the unbreakable chains that bond him are made of the same metal as Thor's hammer. Thus if he could somehow get the hammer to strike the chains, they'd shatter and he'd be freed. While this might seem impossible, Loki actually manages to pull it off. When Thor hurls his hammer at the mountain, Loki magically causes it to be magnetically attracted to his chains. Thus it travels all the way from Earth to Asgard, and shatters them. Since the hammer's now clinging to a pile of broken chains, Thor's not able to recall it back to him. And since he's without his hammer, he's far less powerful than normal. Thus the next step of Loki's evil plan is to get Thor to Asgard, where unlike Earth, he has the home field advantage. To do this, he magically influences Thor to summon their father, Odin, king of the Norse gods. Thor tells Odin about his missing hammer, and asks for help in finding it. Odin agrees, and since Thor can't travel to Asgard without his hammer, he personally takes him to the land himself. But if you're wondering why Thor hasn't turned back into Donald Blake yet, since that's what happens when he's removed from his hammer for more than a minute, well, apparently time stands still when Odin appears on Earth. And Thor doesn't have to worry about that enchantment on Asgard, as he can remain as himself indefinitely there. Once Thor reaches Asgard, Odin tells him that while his hammer is likely there, he, nor any of the other gods can help him, as they're all busy with their own things. In truth, this decision was magically placed into Odin's mind by Loki, as he's trying to lure Thor to his location in the Asgardian wilderness. And it works, as Thor heads out to find his hammer, and first travels to a forest full of old gnarled trees. As he's walking through it, Loki magically brings the trees to life, and orders them to attack him. While he'd normally be able to defeat them with ease, he struggles greatly without his hammer, and realizes that if he's going to survive, he'll need to make a new one. Thus he crafts a wooden mallet out of the branch, trunk, and vines of a tree he's already defeated. Using the crude weapon, he manages to take down the rest of the wicked trees. Realizing that Thor's more powerful and crafty than he'd thought, Loki, having traveled to the forest and hidden in the shadows, retreats back to his original location to devise a more foolproof plan. Before he leaves though, he magically sets Thor's mallet on fire, thereby destroying it. But this was a grave mistake, as watching his mallet suddenly and inexplicably burst into flames, Thor realizes that magic is somehow involved in his hammer's disappearance. And if magic's involved, then more likely than not, so is Loki. Having heard that Loki was chained to a boulder near the Rainbow Bridge, Thor decides to head there next. And while Loki hasn't had time to devise his foolproof plan, he's still got plenty of tricks up his sleeve, as when Thor arrives, he magically transforms a pair of clouds into a pair of massive snarling dragons. Seeing that there's no wood in the area, Loki assumes that Thor won't be able to improvise a hammer, and thus he won't be able to stave off the dragons. But he'd be wrong, as in a truly incredible feat of strength, Thor carves, with just his bare fingers, a makeshift hammer out of a nearby cliffside. When he then hurls it at one of the dragons, he's surprised to find that it doesn't fall to the ground, but flies off towards the Rainbow Bridge. Following the stone weapon, Thor's eventually led to his enchanted hammer, and Loki's pile of chains. Thus he realizes how Loki was able to steal his hammer, and how the cliffside was not made of stone, but of the same metal that his hammer and the chains are. So he reclaims his hammer, but instead of fighting Loki like usual, he simply summons Odin and some other gods, who take him into custody. The issue subsequently ends as Thor returns to Earth, and as Dr. Blake, he taps a patient's knee with a rubber hammer to test his reflexes. The patient complains that Blake's being too rough with the hammer, to which Jane tells him not to worry, as Dr. Blake is very experienced with mallets. Although Blake says nothing, he jokes to himself that she doesn't know the half of it. That concludes Journey into Mystery 92, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a fairly average and unremarkable story. While there was nothing particularly bad about it, it just felt like more of the same, and a retread of what we've already seen in this series. Consider that in issue 89, Dr. Blake was forced by a group of mobsters to operate on their leader, who'd been shot by the police. Doesn't that sound familiar? Admittedly, the Loki stuff was pretty fun, but it also didn't feel much different from his last two appearances. At this point he's been in a third of the Thor issues, and he's pretty much done the same thing in each one. He watches Thor from captivity in Asgard, somehow breaks free, either travels to Earth or lures Thor to Asgard, and then the two fight, either directly or through magical minions. The formula's starting to run thin, and I hope that his next few appearances offer something new. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.